You go. Okay, Ellen, you're all alone, but no. And would you pull out a name tag, everyone, and fill out a name tag and put that on? That would be great. And if this is your first time here tonight, we have an attendance sheet in the basket. If you would please put your name there and your email, and we'd just love collecting a wonderful, amazing list of all who attend LifeU. So thank you for that. And then also in the basket, you will find a question sheet that applies to our Life Talk tonight that our small groups will take part in, but also if you're not in a small group, take it home, talk with your friends, talk afterward, gather with some people, but they're great questions in regards to our Life Talk tonight. Also, there is a biography of our speaker tonight on that. So in preparation for this evening, read that bio, put a name tag on, turn your chairs around so that you're comfortable, and I'm going to turn things over in just a minute or so to Pastor Sarah, just returning from Italy. We welcome Sarah in just a bit.
Living in faith every day. This month we are looking at faith and civic engagement. I was sorry to have missed last week's. I heard it was phenomenal, so I still want to look and watch at it, but just glad that you are here to be a part of the conversation. So let's just take a moment to center ourselves. We come from all different places, doing all different things, and just be reminded that we're in a good holy time and space just because we're together and the Spirit is here and at work. So let's take a moment and acknowledge that. Gracious God, for the gift of today, for the gift of the northern lights last night, for the gift of this community, for the gift of creation, for the gift of knowledge, for the gift of the desire to learn and grow closer to you and to one another. Lord, open our minds and our hearts for all that you have in store for us tonight. And bless Dr. Laura, our speaker, that all may be well. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. The description is phenomenal about tonight, so I hope you've read that and are excited about it. And usually we're like, oh yeah, we're not going to talk about the bio because you guys can read. But when it's a fellow LifeUer that's our speaker, who is a member here and also a friend, I just get so excited, so I have to brag just a little bit about her. Just the fact that she is presented at the United Nations in New York, big deal, and I know her. Like, this, again, is cool. She is a doctorate of philosophy, specializing in human rights. She's taught business ethics at Curtin University, ethics and social justice at the University of Notre Dame, in Australia. So, I mean, there's just we could have a LifeU on life in Australia. Wouldn't that be fun? So anyway, very excited to have her. She's very gifted, very knowledgeable, and she's going to be talking about religious liberty. And for many of us, we hear that word and it's thrown around about we want it, we should have it, or what does it mean, what does it look like, and how does it speak with democracy and politics? So I think it's going to be a riveting evening, and so let's give it up for Dr. Laura Kittel.
Okay, as you heard, we're going to talk about politics and religion, two topics that we're not supposed to talk about in polite company. But you're not very polite, are you? No. And just in time for Thanksgiving, too, so you've got something to contribute when you're around the table. Okay, so before we get started, I'd like to ask, hear from a couple of people, if you've got some idea, when you hear the phrase religious liberty, what comes to mind? What does it make you think of? Is it a good word? Is it a bad one?
The Constitution.
Okay, the Constitution. The Constitution. Excellent. Oh.
Free to choose who and how we worship.
Excellent. Yes, we're free to choose who and how we worship. We think of the Constitution. What else? Is there anything else that comes? Cherish
We
it.
cherish
Yes.
it.
Okay.
All right, there, you got yours.
So we
I'm sitting down.
cherish religious liberty. It's very helpful for us. So while I'm talking tonight, I'll be presenting a certain number of things. You might have a lot of questions that come to mind, and I would encourage you and ask that we hold those until the end. If we've got any time left over, we'll be able to talk about that. But I'll be here afterwards if you want to come and talk to me, and I can even travel around to some groups for discussions if you're interested. All right, so now I'd want to invite us to see religious liberty as something a little bit deeper. Oh, wait, why? Okay, no. Thank you. There we go. Okay, so I want to give you a definition. So religious liberty is the freedom to believe or act and exercise or act upon religious conscience without unnecessary interference from the government. Religious liberty thus involves the freedom to practice religion and also the freedom not to practice religion. And inherent in this idea is the principle of non-coercion. So religious liberty prevents the government from doing what God does not: coerce faith. So God doesn't force us to believe in him or in any religion, right? And this is supported all the way back to the 17th century by the English philosopher John Locke, whose ideas were influential among the American founders. And he argued that no one should be forced to practice a religion they do not believe in, because genuine relationship with God requires a free and voluntary choice. And so we can see here another explainer of this with a diagram here of what religious liberty includes. The individual rights, we're protecting those. The rule of law, we need that in order to protect religious liberty. And pluralism, encouraging diverse beliefs to coexist peacefully. So this is going to be instrumental for us in terms of establishing and maintaining a democracy. So I like John Locke a lot, so I might give you another quote or two from him so we can talk about his ideas later. So he says, the toleration of those that differ from others in matters of religion is so agreeable to the gospel of Jesus Christ and to the genuine reason of mankind that it seems monstrous for men to be so blind as to not to perceive the necessity and advantage of it in so clear a light. And now he's writing, in the 1600s, and he was maybe perhaps a bit ahead of his time because he thought religious toleration, it's based on individual liberty and the separation of church and state, and it should also be extended beyond Christianity. So he says, neither pagan, nor Muslim, nor Jew ought to be excluded from the civil rights of the Commonwealth because of their religion. So he's pretty unique in that area. I think he might not have thought the same thing about Catholics, but we have a wider scope here. And so to go even further with the definition, here's what this right is doing. It's protecting your inner freedom. And when we say religious liberty is a natural right, natural rights give us a sphere of action or space that is protected from outside interference. So think of yourself, you've got this little bubble around you that's protected. And as a natural right, religious liberty means that our hearts and minds are sacred. They're protected. They're where we get to decide what our beliefs look like, and nobody else gets to tell us that. And this is what keeps our integrity and dignity intact. And it's also a fundamental component of a just society. So you've got the right to determine what your conscience looks like. Okay? What you believe, what you feel, what you give your mental assent to, what you hold most sacred. And this is why a lot of the American founders, they called this right among the most sacred of human rights. This is very important. So keep this in mind as we continue, and if you've got any other ideas about religious liberty and maybe how it might be taking different shape and forms in popular discussion these days, we always want to refer back to this little bubble of protection that we've got and the reasons why we've got it there. And also the word religious conscience. This is how you develop your conscience, how you can tell right from wrong, and how you determine how to be a good human being in the world. This is why it's very important. Okay, there's going to be a lot of ground we cover in this presentation, and it might be a little overwhelming, so I'm going to ask you, don't be overwhelmed. Okay, just take this as kind of it's a little buffet. Take a few ideas that appeal to you, and try to remember them, but don't be overwhelmed. Don't be put off by, wow, we're going so fast, I don't know what to take away from this. So if there are 2 or 3 things that you will walk out of here with, I'd love for you to keep in mind. Firstly, that religious liberty, as I've defined it here and in the previous slide, is good. It's good. We need it. It's justified. There's been a lot of philosophers and statesmen since the 1600s who've worked on this. And you're going to see someone else who's your favorite guy. He's going to come along towards the end of a little bit later in the presentation. So religious liberty is good, justified, necessary as both a moral and democratic principle. Okay, and now we're going to get to another one. The United States is not a theocracy. It's not a Christian nation. It has Christians, as we can all attest. But the religion was never written into the law. It's not supposed to be in the law. And now we kind of walk a fine line with this a lot because we do exempt churches from taxes, and we do support different chaplains and things and different public spheres and the military and things, as we saw last week. So it's not very clear-cut, which is why we have to work hard on this and kind of develop some thought and question, well, what is the line here? And this is the questions that have been going on since America was founded. And a lot of people have had a lot of different answers, as we're going to see, but keep in mind that, as Thomas Jefferson said, and as one of the main points, too, that I'd like you to remember, our civil rights have no dependence on our religious opinions. So we can believe whatever we want as far as religion goes, but we all have human rights. Whatever our religious belief is doesn't negate our civil and human rights. Okay, and he also says Christianity neither is nor ever was part of the common law. And to explain this a little bit further, Jefferson says the legitimate powers of government extend to such acts only as are injurious to others. But it does me no injury for my neighbor to say there are 20 gods or no God. It neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg. Okay, and thirdly, in addition to religious liberty being good and necessary and justified, and the fact that we all have civil rights or human rights, no matter what our religions are, and even if we don't have a religion. Lastly, I'd like everybody to keep in mind that religious liberty is in fact essential to democracy, and democracy is essential for religious liberty. And I found a quote by John Witherspoon, who was the only pastor to sign the Declaration of Independence in 1776. And he kind of illustrates the reasoning for this. Or he says, there's not a single instance in history in which civil liberty was lost and religious liberty preserved entire. If therefore we yield up our temporal or worldly property to a tyrant, for example, we at the same time deliver the conscience into bondage. So if we give up our freedoms and in our worldly goods, we also kind of burst that little bubble and sacrifice our religious freedom as well.
Can I just ask for a little clarification here? When you're talking about religious liberty, are you talking in a secular sense? Are you talking in a secular sense? Because to my way of thinking, democracy is not essential for Christian liberty. It would be for religious liberty in a secular sense in a society, but Paul was in chains and he says, I'm free in Christ, you know. And the Jews who were in the Holocaust say, we have never been slaves to anybody because of our relationship with God. So I'm just asking, you know, are you talking all of this in a secular sense?
Yes, so I mean, with the examples that you gave, certainly if we were going to, and we're going to touch on this a little bit later, what certain religious people have said about, in addition to John Witherspoon, who I just mentioned, that would be kind of a different discussion that we could talk about how we can still be free in our mind and heart, regardless of our circumstances. So, yeah, we are just concerned at this moment with what this is going to look like in practice for us as a community of Christians and people in a nation together, and how we're going to live peacefully among each other when we've got a lot of different people and a lot of different faiths. Okay, so religious liberty enables us to freely profess our beliefs, and it also enables us, as I was just saying, to live in a society that respects human beings and their rights, to honor their own conscience and their faith commitments. So liberty is not just for individuals, not just for me or you individually. It's also meant for the flourishing of our society and how we relate to each other as one. Okay, so we've got, if we could imagine for a minute in medieval Europe, that we had a bunch of Christians who fled Europe for America to escape religious persecution. So if you think back then, your belief was such an important part of who you were that you were willing to give up where you lived, maybe some of your family members, Maybe you were persecuted for what you believed in. You thought, I'm packing it up and I'm going to the new world. It's a very risky prospect. You would go on a ship. You had no idea what you would find. You would have to start life in a brand new place. So think about, this is where we're coming from, right? What kind of society do we want to have? Do we want to replicate a society that persecutes people, or do we want one that learns how to maybe welcome diversity and tolerate it in some sense? And so, as you might have noticed in the little blurb in the abstract, some of our questions our main question for this talk is, how can we ensure our faith communities remain on the side of justice, compassion, and human dignity? And we're going to look honestly at another aspect of the church's history. So we've got so in addition to this persecution, we've got a dual legacy here. So sometimes, the church has been a powerful moral force, right? We've been a light in the darkness that provides courage to stand up for what's right, even if it's not popular or easy. And we've also had instances where the church has been involved or complicit in injustice. And so we look at, people on both sides of issues are using the Bible to justify what they're doing. And how do we kind of make a little bit of sense of this in the few minutes we have here? So in discussing this legacy is actually going to give us some clues about how we are to go about remaining on the side of justice and compassion and human dignity. So starting in the early 1800s, pulpits across America told two very different stories about God and freedom. In some sanctuaries, ministers defended slavery as part of a divine order. From pulpits in the South, like Savannah, preachers like Richard Fuller, one of the founders of the Southern Baptist Convention, insisted the relation of master and slave was ordained by Scripture. The Southern Baptist Convention itself was created in 1845 because Southern clergy wanted to continue ordaining slaveholders as missionaries. The Methodist Episcopal Church South split for similar reasons. Even Bishop Stephen Elliott of Georgia, an Episcopal leader, declared in 1862 that slavery was a divinely appointed trust. These sermons, quoting verses like "Slaves, obey your masters" from Ephesians, gave theological cover to one of the greatest evils in human history. But in other smaller churches that were poorer and maybe even despised, believers risked everything to oppose that same system. So we've got Quaker meeting houses in Pennsylvania and New Jersey became secret stations on the Underground Railroad. And we've got black churches throughout the South that also send people coded messages to get from the South to the North to escape slavery. And at Mother Bethel AME Church in Philadelphia and countless hidden chapels, faith required resistance. A century later, the same conflict reappeared in the civil rights movement. On the one side stood pastors who told Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to slow down, that his marches were untimely or unwise. In 1963, 8 white clergymen in Birmingham, Alabama, published an open letter urging patience and law and order. King's response from his cell, the letter from Birmingham jail, remains one of the great moral documents of our time. He wrote, "Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will." So in that same era, thousands of churches became engines of justice. We have Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, sermons turned into strategy sessions. at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, parishioners organized the Montgomery bus boycott, choosing to walk miles rather than surrender their dignity. And through these actions, they helped shift the moral conscience of a nation. And so this pattern isn't limited to America. In the 1930s in Germany, as the Nazi regime consolidated power, the majority of churches joined the German Christian movement, baptizing nationalism with religious language and replacing crosses with swastikas. Pastors were required to swear loyalty to Hitler. But a smaller network of believers, the Confessing Church, for example, refused. They gathered secretly to affirm the Barmen Declaration of 1934, written in part by theologian Karl Barth, declaring the church must obey Christ alone, not any earthly Führer. One of their pastors, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, became a central voice of resistance. He wrote, "Silence in the face of evil is itself evil," and was ultimately imprisoned and executed for participating in plots to oppose the regime. And I found this quote from one of his 1934 sermons on 2 Corinthians. He said, "Christianity stands or falls with its revolutionary protest against violence, arbitrariness, and pride of power, and with its plea for the weak. Christians are doing too little to make these points clear rather than too much. Christendom adjusts itself far too easily to the worship of power. Christians should give more offense, shock the world far more than they are doing now. Christians should take a stronger stand in favor of the weak rather than considering the possible right of the strong." So Bonhoeffer's courage and the courage of those who refuse to make faith the servant of tyranny reminds us that religious liberty is not just the right to worship freely. It is the responsibility to speak truth even when it is unpopular or even dangerous to do so. So here we have a timeline. And what we find with across the century, these patterns, we see them repeating. And what we find from this is that when the church can align with conscience, it brings light and justice. It opens a space for people to follow their conscience and to voice a different opinion than what is in power. And whenever faith aligns with power, it can become part of the darkness. So, religious liberty, rightly understood, is what keeps a person free to choose the light. It's also why we really need it. And, okay. So, how do we ensure the church remains on the side of justice? Okay, I was debating where to put the next slide, and I had quite a long sort of introduction there. I'm not sure if I should put this earlier, maybe, but we do have some goals and outcomes here that I'd like for us to achieve. So by the end of our time together, I'm hoping that the overall goal, that you'll not only grasp why religious liberty matters, but feel compelled and equipped to keep conscience on fire and democracy alive. And the three outcomes I'm hoping for is that we're going to understand religious liberty as a moral and democratic principle. So that means that, religious liberty as a moral principle, it helps us get along with each other in society. It helps us create a just society. It's the right thing to do. And then we're going to connect faith and democracy. We might be a little too ambitious here, but we're going to try to get enough of this in. So we want to have an idea of how religious liberty relates to Christian faith and democracy. We could really go for 6 hours or 6 months. I don't know. But there are shared values between Christianity and democracy that are really important, and we do want to emphasize why it's important to safeguard conscience. And some of these values, of course, are truth, accountability, freedom, and care for the vulnerable. So those are values of a democracy, and those are also values that we would hopefully recognize as Christians. And we're also going to get to the First Amendment and the wall of separation between church and state. And lastly, which a lot of this you might be talking about in your groups afterwards, commit to 3 concrete actions as a faith community that embody liberty as responsibility following this action blueprint: speak, protect, and serve. So speak, defend freedom of faith or conscience for everyone. Protect human beings and strengthen democracy. Serve as a moral witness. Promote justice. Build a flourishing society. So, up front, I'm going to give you one answer of how we ensure the church remains on the side of justice, compassion, and human dignity. So, to ensure we remain on that side, we need to preserve religious liberty and conscience, the right of every person to determine their faith and the sanctity of their own mind and heart, and to truly question things and consider the demands of justice. Okay, and now, because I'm also a philosopher and we need a little philosophical grounding, and I'm hoping that this is going to give you some background when you encounter religious liberty out in the wild. You're going to maybe see some of these dynamics occurring, and you're going to think back to this presentation. You're going to say, I know what's going on here. I can maybe explain a little bit to people around me. Because it can be kind of confusing. On the one hand, we've got our private religious beliefs, and then we've got politics. We've got a lot of stuff going on, and how are we supposed to cope with that? What do we do with what we think is morally right as individuals or as individual Christians, and how do we enter the sphere of politics and talk about these things? Well, there is tension, okay? So it's not always clear cut. We gotta think about what's going on and what we need to be doing in the wider world. So if it doesn't feel comfortable to you, there's good reason for that. And in order to get us there, I first want to ask, by a show of hands, what does anybody like to work on cars, or maybe take apart electronics? You like to see what makes things work. Maybe you do word puzzles, maybe you do some sort of craft according to a pattern. You like to see, you get under the hood. This is what philosophers are doing. So imagine that's the cosmos. We like to open it up and try to see what's going on here. And that's our curiosity. So we want to get a better sense of that here. And as a philosopher, I ask not only what is, but what ought to be. So in philosophy, we make value judgments. It's one way we differ from sciences or fields that discuss related issues like political science. You'll get a lot of analyses from political scientists. And they're supposed to remain, largely value neutral. They're going to present you with a lot of facts and a lot of, the dynamics of what's going on in the world. They work to describe, analyze, and predict what is. But moral and political philosophers like myself were tasked not only investigating what is in the world, but what ought to be in the world. We make value judgments like this thing is good, this thing is bad. And we have a lot of carefully reasoned moral value systems. We're not going to go into all of it, don't worry, but just a little bit here. So in moral philosophy, when we're looking at moral concepts, what are those? They are the standards and beliefs that help people live cooperatively, often including principles like fairness, harm avoidance, loyalty, and respect. In a more technical definition, ethics is a branch of value theory devoted to exploring the broad rules which define, regulate, and constrain our social lives. So they're really meant to help us get along with each other on an individual level, and then, as we see in a moment, on a wider societal level. So some central questions of ethics. In ancient ethics, in ancient Greece, we were looking at, how should I live? That's a very broad question. Today, we think of ethics mostly in terms of what's the right thing to do, and we analyze certain problems or dilemmas. But really, the larger question, how should I live? And so we have the three prominent systems of ethics today, or normative ethics, that we largely talk about: utilitarianism, deontology, or duty-based ethics, and virtue ethics. And our views on what's right and wrong and how we should live are often shaped by a wide variety of things. So you've got moral intuition. Your parents are your first teachers about what's right and wrong, hopefully. You've got your peers, your experiences in life, cultural values, education. Maybe you've taken an ethics class. But of course, what else have we got? We've got our religion. So Christianity is going to have a lot to say about how we should live our lives, right? And it goes a bit beyond certain concepts that are found within all of these branches. So we might say moral virtues like avoiding harm and being loyal and respecting people. You can find those concepts throughout all of the different types of ethics, but you're going to have that in Christianity with a little bit more. And that's when we take that then into the public sphere, that's where things can get a little bit tricky. And so then we would ask the question, especially given the lists I gave you earlier, whose Christianity are we going to want to, if we were to institute that in society, who's going to be chosen for that? So that's why also in religious liberty we say we can't pick one. We've got to have some sort of freedom and ability to get along with each other without instituting one particular faith into our society. Okay, and what's happening here is that then political philosophy, what that does is it applies moral ideas, justice, dignity, freedom to the social sphere. That's what political philosophers are doing. And they're asking, how should we as social beings live together? What kind of society should we build together? What does a just society look like? How can we enact, respect, and protect human rights? So, political philosophers, we seek to establish basic principles that will, for instance, justify a particular form of state, or how individuals have certain inalienable rights, or tell us how a society's material resources should be shared among its members. We're looking at how best to arrange our collective life, our political institutions, and our social practices. So that includes economic systems and even our patterns of family life. Covers a lot of stuff. So when we're talking about these things, we've got certain sort of steps we want to go through. So if we've got our own personal views of what's right and wrong, and maybe our faith is really heavily involved in that, before we're going to apply this to society, we have a step in the middle here. So we want to consider, how is that going to impact other people? In terms of, are we respecting their rights? How do we incorporate what we might believe? Can we apply that to everyone, or is that more of a personal faith belief that needs to stay more within our own realm? So we have to take an extra step. We consider what is appropriate to apply across the board to society at large. How would it affect people's rights and conscience who might believe something, very different from what I believe? They might have a different religion, a different tradition. Where do we draw the lines here? And how can we respect one another and protect their sanctity of their own minds and hearts and conscience? So, okay, now I think it's time. You all look ready for a pop quiz. So take out your pens, and if you've got a piece of paper there, write down what you think here. So when we get things confused between moral and political philosophy, often that happens, and we're talking about moral values and applying them to society. It's not common for us to realize that religion and civil society have different ends or purposes. What are they? Take a moment to make a choice and see if you can fill in the blanks here. The end or purpose of civil society is, what is it? The end or purpose of Christianity. I'm expecting all the pastors in the room to get that one. I filled in the first and last letters for you. Okay. So we've all had a minute. I was going to play the Jeopardy music for this. We gotta. Okay. We ready? I think we're ready. Oh. The end of civil society is justice. That's what we're aiming for. The end of Christianity is salvation. That's what your pastors are trying to help you achieve. And so for every religion might have a slightly different vision of what the end for us is going to look like. Okay, so we have James Madison, the primary author of the Constitution, says the end of civil society is justice. And justice is secured by protecting human, natural, individual rights, ensuring fairness, and seeking the common good. That's why civil society exists, to pursue justice. Freedom and property, those factor in there. They're not the ultimate end. They file under there in some level of importance. So Christianity, again, it aims at salvation, reconciliation, inner transformation, and ultimate flourishing in God. So they have different ends. Justice concerns our life together in this world. Salvation concerns our destiny beyond it. And we're going to hear from John Locke again in his letter concerning toleration, that so they figured this out, 1600s. The proper concern of government, he says, was limited to civil interests or the preservation of peace, order, and the people's earthly well-being. The people have entrusted the government with this responsibility, along with the right to use force and coercion when necessary. So the government can use force. We've got prison, we've got the justice system. But guess what? The government's scope of action and authorities does not extend to religious affairs. Locke argues that spiritual matters like care of immortal souls and their guidance to salvation are the proper concerns of religion. So, and he's not saying that the members of government still can express religious opinions, but they do so as individuals seeking to influence others through uncoerced persuasion. They cannot do so through laws or state power. So what he doesn't want is judges on the bench adjudicating something to do with religious belief, care of souls, things like that. And he says, no peace and security among mankind, let alone common friendship, can ever exist as long as people think that governments get their authority from God and religion is propagated by force of arms. And so, where are we? Perfect, okay. And what happens when these things kind of get tangled up? Because, it's not very clear. We're walking a tightrope between what is and isn't right between these spheres. So what can happen? Oh, okay. Turns out that's not on the card deck. Okay, so when the church tries to act as the state, we can drift toward theocracy. This is where things can get problematic. And when the state tries to control the church, we risk oppression. And one form of this is Christian nationalism, which I'll return to later. So when both forget their limits, injustice follows. And people at, John Locke and a lot of the American founders, they thought combining the two weakens and corrupts them both. So they wanted to keep them separate. Government could flourish, largely on its own. Religion was better off without interference from government. So clarifying these two particular ends doesn't fracture faith in society. It allows them to do what they both do best. So religion doesn't need the state to flourish, and the state, has to be careful when it's engaging with religion. And so to foreshadow part of our conclusion, maybe some of these analyses, when you saw what was going on with moral philosophy and political philosophy, this might help you when you're looking at news stories and you're seeing, people thinking, maybe we should have religion on a national level. What's going on with this dynamic? And is the motivation behind that one to overstep a certain bound or impose or coerce people? Okay. Now that we've set the moral foundation, let's see how our founders tried to preserve it. So we've got the First Amendment and the Wall of Separation. The First Amendment, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And in his letter to the Danbury Baptist Association, in 1802, Thomas Jefferson wrote that the First Amendment builds a wall of separation between church and state. And this is how Jefferson and the other founders understood the First Amendment clauses. And this has really served as kind of the basis for how we're interpreting this since then, and how we're interpreting the First Amendment even in the Supreme Court. And if we're looking at this, the historical context and the support for this also came from pastors and ministers, and believe it or not, the Baptists. So this phrase drew on earlier ideas such as those of Roger Williams, who became a Baptist minister, who had written a wall of separation between the garden of the church and the wilderness of the world, that one of those exists. And Williams, he was a pioneer of religious liberty, and he was actually kicked out of Massachusetts for promoting religious liberty. So at that time, they didn't really buy that on a statewide level. And since he was expelled from Massachusetts, he went on to establish Rhode Island as a colony. So these Jefferson's wall of separation, as well as Roger Williams, it's not hostility to religion, but a safeguard for conscience and pluralism. So they're not saying religion is worthless, we don't want to look at it anymore. It's like, we want to protect it. We want to safeguard this for people. So Religious liberty protects both faith communities and democracy, right? But this is not all we were thinking back when this was written, okay? And this is where it's going to get a little bit more overwhelming, but just take a look. So we had 6 founding principles that inform the First Amendment. So when the First Amendment was being written, we also had Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. Oh, wait, we'll put a pin in that. We'll get back to it. Okay, the constitutional experiment with religious rights can't be solely reduced to the First Amendment's religion clauses, but all of these things and all these ideas about rights were drawn from 6 recurring principles: liberty of conscience, disestablishment, free exercise, religious pluralism, religious equality, the separation of church and state. So all of these are informing the First Amendment. So, and the First Amendment was designed to incorporate or embody these and broader constitutional precepts. Okay, so again, don't worry about each one of these. I'm going to tell you about disestablishment first, because this is really interesting, and maybe this is the only one we're going to get to. But prior to the American Revolution, numerous colonies possessed established religions that regulated life among their inhabitants, outlawed other denominations, and punished people with imprisonment or execution for unorthodox beliefs. The Church of England in Virginia, for example, made the presence of Quakers illegal. The assembly punished heretics with burning, and those who denied or struggled with their faith were, among other things, sentenced to 3 years in prison. So you might want to not admit that publicly, right? You're struggling with your faith. So what happened was Thomas Jefferson and James Madison looked at that and said, well, we got to do something about this. Because we all came together to achieve independence, and if we don't address this issue with religion and how we're going to live together, we're never going to get it done, because everybody thinks something different. So we've got to rally the people again to get behind this idea of religious liberty. And he wrote another document on religious liberty that is also very inspiring. And he says, whereas Almighty God hath created the mind free, that all attempts to influence it by temporal punishment or burthens, 3 years in jail, or by civil incapacitations tend only to beget habits of hypocrisy and meanness. Okay. So we're going to take a look at what we really want to know. What did Martin Luther think? He supported the separation of church and state. Okay? So they should be kept separate. He talked about a paper wall between the church, spiritual matters, and the government or worldly matters. He used this idea to develop a complex concept called 2 separate kingdoms. Okay, so even Luther is joining this discussion now, and is part of the heritage of the founding. And we really want to know liberty as responsibility. How do we get, again, if we're looking at religious liberty and we're thinking it's only, freedom to do what I want, freedom to express my faith in private and in public. Well, it's a little bit more than that. So the founders and many of our most powerful religious leaders saw liberty differently, as moral responsibility. So they thought real liberty, it's not just getting what I want or what my religious group wants. It's safeguarding conscience and character and the common good, societal flourishing of everyone. So if you recall, moral concepts are standards and values that help people live cooperatively. They include principles like fairness, harm avoidance, loyalty, respect, the virtues, and in fact, a lot of the moral theories we have in philosophy, and you'll find this as well in religious faith, a foundational concept is harm and care. So we want to talk about and think about when we're thinking about how we should live our lives and how we should treat other people. We are concerned for the well-being of others, and we want to avoid causing them harm. So the purpose of faith is not to dominate, subjugate, humiliate, or exploit other people. I think hopefully we would all agree with that. And we would say religious liberty there are limits to it. So, and those limits, might be few and far between, and it may only be limited by law when necessary and proportionate to, 1, protect others' rights, or 2, protect public order. So when we're thinking about our right of religious liberty, it stops at the other person's nose. Okay, you can't cause violence, okay? And freedom requires virtue. It asks us to use our conscience not for self-interest, but for service. And again, James Madison thought, religion flourishes in greater purity without the aid of government. So it's freedom for moral duty and not from it. Okay. Perfect. Okay. What do we got? Okay, so we got, a lot of challenges. Some of these I don't need to go into great depth because you've seen them. We would say that the idea of religious liberty, rightly understood as I presented it tonight, offers an antidote to a lot of these problems. It calls us back to truth, conscience, and compassion. So we've got, with Christian nationalism, the state will weaponize the church. And believe it or not, this ideology of white Christian nationalism in the United States goes back to the 1600s. Okay, and some of the adherents believe that America was founded by Christians who modeled its laws and institutions after Protestant ideals with a mission to spread the religion and those ideals in the face of threats from non-whites, non-Christians, and immigrants. But as I have demonstrated today, that is false. The United States was founded on religious tolerance and liberty, and its laws and institutions were not modeled after Protestant Christian ideals that intended to enforce religious faith. So we want to consider modern faith communities that stand with refugees, defend voting rights, or shelter the unhoused, not to impose belief, but to protect dignity. And there are some other shared values and ideas that we're not going to go into now, but these are all some of the values that Christianity and democracy share. So it's a good list. You're going to have a lot of nuance and a lot of particular ideas there, but there's a lot of resources you can draw on to talk about religion and politics, okay, and values that Christianity shares with democracy. Okay, we want to review the sacred responsibility of the church. Defend the truth, resist falsehoods that can corrupt conscience, promote justice, stand with the vulnerable, and hold power accountable. Build a society where all can flourish. Model, so embody your faith. Model compassion, humility, and courage. And every commitment named here is a living expression of religious liberty, the kind that makes democracy flourish. Okay, and our closing vision and call to action. So, what we did today, we're closing with our 3 goals. We've come to understand religious liberty as a moral and democratic principle, and not only as a legal one. We've connected Christian faith and democracy through shared values of truth, freedom, and care for the vulnerable. We've named actions in our community. Well, you're going to do that in your small groups. Actions that you can take to defend justice and dignity. And at the end of all of this, we want to say that religious liberty protects both justice and salvation, the civic and the sacred dimensions of human flourishing, And may we carry that religious liberty or that freedom, not as a shield for ourselves, but as a light for the world.
Thank you for sharing your light with us. About my mind is kind of exploding, and the one word I take with me is flourishing. Just that call for all to flourish, and what is the best way we do that as people of faith and in our democracy. So thank you so much. I know your small group time is going to be phenomenal. Sue Leonardson, is we're going to have some changes with our small group location, so you have better opportunities to hear and to share. But I do really want to push next week's Reverend Kedar Kahila Lila is going to be here. He's actually from Palestine. He works for the ELCA. He's at the desk of Arab and Middle Eastern Ministries, and he is going to talk about what is it to live under occupation. It's going to be incredibly powerful, so I do hope you'll come back next week. But let's give it up for Sue, who's going to give us our assignments for today.
Thank you. What a night. Take your question sheets home. They're great. We just have a few changes. We thought we better do it right here, where we have Cindy Rose, her group with Mary Post leading. You are changing to meet in the nook by the fireplace, so follow Mary Post tonight. Steve Reinengans. Steve, where are you? Steve is now meeting on second floor in room 203, so follow Steve. Steve Anderson, right back there. He's already at his table. The men's group is meeting back there. These are all changes tonight. Sandy Cedargren and Robin Mavis's group, we're going to meet in the gathering area. I'm going to meet with that group, and anybody who would like to join a small group, get involved, meet with us out in the gathering area. Follow me out that way. Have a great small group, and thanks for being here tonight, everyone.